We all know about Joe Burrow's wrist injury, but I don't think a lot of people understand truly what we could be dealing with here. He is the only pro quarterback to have ever dealt with this wrist injury before. And we've seen it throughout training camp that he has not been able to throw for back-to-back days very often, and it has lingered. And, we saw that video of him trying to pick up the water bottle. So basically, we want to discuss like the long-term picture for the Bengals and if they're in a bad situation, because Dobbs, we'll get right into the discussion, but here are the basic facts I want to lay out for everybody. Joe Burrow signed a 5-year contract for $275 million, including a $40 million signing bonus, and $219 million of that $275 million is guaranteed. That's an average salary of $55 million with a potential out in 2028. He's played 78% of his games since he came into the league. They went to the Super Bowl, they went to a conference championship, but they lost both. He had 2 surgeries already, one on his knee and one on his wrist. The Bengals are currently the 3rd oldest roster in the league, but going into 2025, they have the 13th most cap space. But with that being said, they still have to extend Jamar Chase. So, if we want to look at this from a very broad sense, this roster is technically a compete now roster. And we've seen it with the Bills where they want to reshape their team and, they got rid of Diggs and it's a new iteration of the Buffalo Bills. But it has felt like at least that the Bengals have been closer than the Bills have because they've beaten Patrick Mahomes. They've gone to that Super Bowl. What does the future look like for the Bengals if this wrist injury continues to linger for Joe Burrow?
So, and Hunter, some context I want to add here is I actually have it pulled up right here, ready to go. Big shouts to Jesse Morse, MD, at Dr. Jesse Morse on X. So here's the full explanation to the injury too, so everybody has some context. Because again, Hunter, a lot of people don't necessarily have real context on this. You just get the report that it's a quote unquote serious wrist injury. And back to the whole thing of how a lot of people think that when someone's healed or they're back to practice, they're back to the game, that all of a sudden the injury just erases itself. So here's the facts on the injury. Burrow suffered a season-ending. I'm quoting the exact thing directly here. Burrow suffered a season-ending right. I can't pronounce that, but I'm going to try. Scapholonate ligament tear in his throwing wrist on November 16th, 2023 against the Baltimore Ravens. Initially, it was speculated that it was a TFCC complex tear. Unfortunately, it was worse. The word I couldn't pronounce, ligament complex tear. This ligament is very important for the stability of the wrist. And since this / most ligaments have a poor blood supply, it needed to be repaired. I asked an orthopedic hand surgeon colleague his thoughts on the injury as it pertains to Burrow, and here was his response. Quote, "It's a bad injury to have. Invariably always leads to instability over time and arthritis at a much earlier age." End quote. So there are multiple things to address there, but let's just start with the things that stand out most. It was much more serious injury than a lot of people thought. And I think the thing that stands out to me most, Hunter, is the thing with the arthritis. Because as we know, in any professional sport, when you start to develop arthritis, and we saw Todd Gurley is the most recent example, how you can go from being at the literal top of your position to quite literally not being able to be an NFL competitor within a span of about 2 to 3 years, generally speaking. And again, not to sit here and say that that's where we're at with Joe Burrow, but there hits a point where we have to start, not to say hitting the panic button, but being objective. And this is us being objective. The point of the matter is here, Hunter, this is a very serious situation and incredibly concerning.
Yeah, I think my thing that really plays a role in my concern is, the issue with being able to throw on back-to-back days. And I know during the NFL season, you're not going to be throwing back-to-back in games, right? And you can rest him during practice. But what happens when we're in week 18? What happens when we're in week 1 of the playoffs and his wrist ain't ready to go? Like, this seems like an issue that really hasn't gotten better. Like, it may feel better and he may be throwing, but the frequency in which we hear about it, the frequency in which we, are seeing it. And the other thing is, I think this has just become a thing with Joe Burrow, unfortunately, where he had the knee surgery. And then if you remember back last year, I think, don't you remember he had like a lingering calf injury for like the first couple weeks of the season? So it's almost like he's always been injured, which is unfortunate because he is at the top of his game, one of the best quarterbacks in the league. But when you have a situation where you're going to have to pay Jamar Chase an absorbent amount of money and you have an aging roster, it's almost like, is the window already closed for the Buffalo Bills? Or the Buffalo Bills. It's the Cincinnati Bengals. Is it closed for the Cincinnati Bengals? I think they have a good shot as anybody, but the injury does really, really concern me. And I think there is also some rhyme or reason why when Burrow was hurt, we still saw success in the offense because they really started running it under center, and Joe Burrow really doesn't want to run it under center.
No, that's a great point, Hunter. And everything you just touched on is absolutely spot on. And I think I want to touch on even some bigger issues too here I want to bring up. Look, we already addressed it, but let's go deeper into the problem. Because, again, I don't want to sit here and make it sound like I'm making the direct comparison by any means. But it's something we have to look at because it's what we're witnessing unfold right in front of our eyes right now. And again, different circumstances, albeit yes, but still potentially similar outcomes now. And you're going to see what I'm going with this. We saw what happened with Deshaun Watson with the money he's taking now, where the roster's in place. And again, like I said, Cleveland is a different situation. I think Cleveland's roster is much more sound fundamentally. There's a lot more pieces that are younger, and you have a lot more in place on the Browns roster, right? But the reality is where you can compare the point of, and again, not that Joe Burrow's at this point yet, but if it gets to that point where you are paying one guy on the offense a big chunk of your salary cap, and when you're paying the big chunk to somebody who's A, not able to be out there every single week, and B, not the same person that you paid in the first place in terms of health and in terms of productivity, well, all of a sudden, you're in a big just hole. Simplest way to say it. And to the point of that, the fact, like, the Bengals are not getting any younger, Hunter, and really, the young pieces that they've added recently, let's just call it for what it is. A lot of them have not made the impact that the Bengals are looking for them to make. I'll even bring it as recent as to Miles last year, Miles Turner that they drafted.
Miles Murphy.
Why does it Miles Turner? Yeah, Miles, I'm over here mixing guys up, but Miles Murphy. We're seeing Miles Murphy has it. Well, there you go. That's actually a great point. I'm mixing his name up because we haven't seen Miles Murphy making any plays. He's falling off the depth chart. I actually remember I brought that up a couple months ago on a video we were talking about the Bengals, and there was a lot of Bengals fans in the comments saying that that's not true. That's false. Well, someone prove me wrong because it clearly is true. He's a young guy who's not getting reps. And, to bring this to PFF real quick, this is also why you should be concerned if you're a Bengals fan. Let's look at the older guys on this roster and see how they graded out for week one, right? Okay, Sam Hubbard graded out at a 48.7. All right, BJ Hill graded out at a 46.8. Sheldon Rankins graded out at a 60.5. And Trey Hendrickson graded out at a 65, albeit I still have faith that Trey will bounce back. But however, the three other guys, if Miles Murphy can't get in there and get reps over these guys that are grading this low, objectively speaking, you should be concerned as a Bengals fan. And it's not just Miles, it's a lot of guys. The bottom line is that a lot of the young guys the Bengals have brought in are not making the impact that they want them to make or that they drafted them to make. And you pile that on top of the fact that we are potentially dealing with Joe Burrow, I don't want to say regressing, but kind of stuck in injury purgatory right now. It hits a point where we have to ask ourselves, yeah, we still think the Bengals are going to be really competitive this year and in the future, but how long can we for sure buy into that if this continues being what we see week to week? Because again, it is week one, hand up. This could look like something that was not worth discussing in a few weeks. And the Bengals have shown that they have that pedigree where they can do that. So I want to be clear, Bengals fans, we're not saying that it's doomsday, that it's over. Absolutely not. But the bottom line is we would be foolish not to discuss this because it is true that the older guys on the roster are being less productive. The younger guys aren't stepping up, and Joe Burrow is injured. All that is objectively true, and that is a recipe for concern.
But Dobbs, I would argue that even if the Bengals are successful this year, let's just say they win a playoff game, right? Like, successful season, like, obviously you want to win a Super Bowl if you're the Cincinnati Bengals. That doesn't take away the cause for concern if Joe Burrow is still dealing with the wrist injury. Like, and this is where it's a tough situation for the Bengals. You couldn't not pay him. Like, in no world or any scenario would it have been okay for them not to pay him. Injury concerns out the window, you can't not pay a guy that in his second year behind a rougher O-line took you to a Super Bowl.
Essentially his rookie year too, might we add.
Yeah, so it's just one of those things where nobody's really in the wrong here. It's just one of those unfortunate situations between a player and a team and the NFL. This is the league, right? Like, these situations happen. I really like Joe Burrow. I just, we see it. I've seen it. I feel like a lot with like quarterbacks, like shoulder injuries, right? Whenever a quarterback has a shoulder injury, it really concerns me, especially on the throwing arm, because we know when Cam Newton had the shoulder injuries, he just never looked the same after. Deshaun Watson's had the shoulder injuries, and there may be other reasons, like he hasn't played in a long time and he hasn't been able to stay on the field. But does the arm look the same? To me, it doesn't. So I could only imagine what a wrist would do if a shoulder affects you that much. So I don't know. Like, there's really, it's so funny because there's everything to talk about here, but there's really nothing to talk about. Joe Burrow is the quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals for the foreseeable future. It's more about, will the Bengals be able to succeed knowing that Joe Burrow might not be ready to go or can't play 17 games a year?
No, absolutely. And again, like that's the bottom line, Hunter. And I just want to add before we close out, just the, final thing for Bengals fans that haven't watched our content before, let it be clear because, people always like to jump to the hater accusation. But listen, I'm an LSU fan. Joe Burrow is one of the heroes forever for every LSU faithful, and he always will be. Like Joe Burrow is one of my guys forever. This is only objective speak. And again, it comes from a place of concern. Hopefully, Joe Burrow turns this around. Hopefully, he shows us that we're concerned about nothing and that he's a superhero that we think he is and he can turn this around, right? Turn this ship and sail it backwards. But until that we see that happen, it has to be something that we at least discuss. That's what we did today. And that's just how it has to be.
Thank you guys so much for watching. If you don't know ball and want to know ball, be sure to subscribe, leave a like. Let us know in the comments if you think this is something that Joe Burrow is going to have to deal with going forward. And, if there's any situations you think could play out where Joe Burrow maybe isn't the quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals in 2 years. I don't think there is, but I think it's not 100% out of the question. But thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your night.